They looked like rehearsals, pre-dawn drills when the light was a smear and the world was cold, practice charges across a field versus a hulking scrap metal target, timed reloads under artificial stress. Bert Close, the loader, was a mechanical mind. He pried and cleaned and listened to the tank's innards in a way that made the machine responsive. Willis, the gunner, learned to read Pool's eye and begin tracking before Pool spoke. Wilbert Richards watched the Hull machine gun and the flanks for infantry with a gaze that could find a shadow 100 yards off. Del Boggs, behind the controls, learned to hit a hedgerow and hold the Sherman in place like a living spear. These were not improvisations born of whim. They were deliberate, rancid with the urgency of men who had watched friends die in ways that doctrine had told them were necessary. Over days and brutal repetition, the crew's performance improved in measurable ways. A reload that first took 12 seconds collapsed toward 6. The gunner could bring a target into his sights with a quarter turn quicker. The driver could position the hull to present weld lines and slopes that neutralized some of the German gun's advantage. Pool formalized what he had intuited into 5 practical, repeatable principles, stated plainly and then practiced until muscle and blood remembered them. He taught them to his crew like a sermon of survival. Close the distance deliberately and without hesitation. Choose and control the engagement angle to present the gun, not the hull. Synchronize the crew so every motion is an answer to the next. Accelerate reloading until rhythm and not panic rules the turret. And accept audacity only when it is backed by discipline, not bravado. Those principles read, cold on paper, like a violation of established orders. In action, they became a kind of discovery. When a Sherman charged at dawn into a sunlit lane toward a concealed panther and the crew moved as if it were a single animal, the panther's heavy gun might find purchase on armor that would otherwise have killed it. But often, the Sherman's short-range penetration, a well-placed shot into side or rear, ended the duel before the bigger gun could finish the man inside. Pool's method was a tax on coordination. It demanded that men work as minnows in a high-current stream, all timing and recall. It was also a blunt arithmetic. By moving to zones where German crews expected them not to be, Shermans minimized the advantage of range and maximized the chance that a sudden burst of speed and accurate fire could break through. June 12th was the first public proof in heat and smoke. Pool's section met a German element that outclassed them on paper. The field that morning was split by a sunken road and dotted with farm buildings. Pool drove like a man who had counted the seconds from his childhood thrills as if they were now trophies. He ordered a charge at a line of German tanks that had not expected to be rushed that close. When he later described it, he would say little, only that they hit the flank and that the world narrowed to the squeal of tracks and the clatter of fired shells. A panther went up in smoke. A stug burned. The crew of one German tank bailed, stunned, and later prisoner. Word moved through the division not as doctrine, but as rumor. The small man with the quick crew. Rumor hardened into reputation by June 26th, when another hedgerow meeting produced similar results, and the tally beside Pool's name shifted upward. His methods attracted attention up the chain and teeth from doctrine keepers at staff meetings. Some commanders frowned at the apparent recklessness. Others, who had lost men in set-piece ambushes, watched with a guarded recalculation. Pool did not romanticize risk. He measured it. He argued for it in the only language military men accepted: results. His crew's casualty rate compared favorably with comrades who clung to cover and waited for engineered support. In the field, results outweighed manuals.
There were, of course, close calls whose memories would not leave them. Once a Panzerfaust found the rear of a Sherman in the smeared light of dusk. The loader bore the echo of the hit in his hands for months after. On another day, a Tiger's main gun punched around through the glacis plate, and the turret shuddered like a struck animal. In these moments, Pool's instinct was simple: protect his men, finish the enemy, and move on. The hunter and his pack had rules, and they followed them. Tactics were only one part of the tale. Psychology held the other half. A crew that rehearsed at dawn learned the language of silence. They developed rituals, small private acts that kept fear at bay. Bert would check the bolt and tap the shell casings in an order that meant, "I am ready." Willis would polish the sight until it flashed like an eye. Dell would lay his hand on the gear shift the way a man might lay a finger on a child's head. Those gestures were not superstitious. They were a code of mutual assurance. Pool's voice, when he spoke in the cramped heat of the turret, was the only sound louder than the engine. It was short, directive, and often dry with humor to cut tension. "On my mark," he would say, and every man inside would become a part of the machine, not as a loss of self, but as a concentration of purpose. As success mounted, so did the legend. Reporters and officers called him an ace, and the press printed numbers. Army analysts, later and with more sober pens, would catalog the practices Pool's crew had honed: speed of close quarters engagement, synchronized reload training, hull down positioning exploited by quick advances, the use of local terrain as forcing grounds, and the psychological payoff of audacity backed by process. For years, those ideas circulated in after-action reports and were annotated in margins, but they did not immediately overturn entrenched doctrine. The Army is a slow machine, and institutions prefer caution.
Then came September 19, 1944, the date that cleaved a life in two. The day began like others in the way the sky conspired with fatigue and thin autumn light. Pool's crew moved through a damaged Belgian village. Ruins of stone and timber made the map of fields uncertain. Somewhere ahead, in a lane hedged with trees and scarred by shell craters, enemy anti-tank positions waited with patient malice. A round, whose precise origin the men later argued in hospital corridors and letters home, could have been any one of several lethal implements, found the turret. It ripped through the clatter and left a silence that was worse than the noise. Pool was hit. The radio's chatter turned from commands to stunned questions. Medical personnel later called the injury severe. His evacuation was quick, and surgeons worked with the urgency of men tending a machine they had to save. He would never return to command in the field. For the crew, the moment after the hit was an odd, terrible lucidity. They moved into a different kind of discipline. Treacherous orders for aid. Hands steady as they could be. Then the slow, cold administration of the knowledge that their leaders' days of charging hedgerows were over. In the weeks that followed, as bandages were replaced by surgery and convalescence, the practical consequences of the wound were catalogued into lists. Lost campaigns, medals recommended but never fully vindicated at the highest level, letters of commendation that did not balance the absence of a living presence in the line. Pool became, to contemporaries and to himself, a man who had translated hunting instincts into doctrine and then been removed from the field by a single errant shot. The aftermath was quieter than the fighting.
Hospital wards smell of antiseptic and the low rumble of distant trains. They are places where maps of the world shrink to the person in the bed. Pool's recovery was stubborn and private. He learned to accept new limits the way a farmer learns the yield of a new season, by attention and patience. Those who served under him scattered into other units, some dead, some home, some carrying the silence of things they had seen. In barracks and later in reunions, they would not make much speech of heroism. They exchanged practical information, small jokes, and the occasional look that asked a question better left unspoken. The larger consequence of Pool's experiments, what the title of this story calls the accidental discovery, was not obvious in the weeks after he left the line. It took time for doctrine and history to catch up with practice. Military study staffs, after-war analysts, and later historians would pore over after-action reports and German unit logs, tracing patterns that had been visible in the moment only to those who charged into them. Pool's method had revealed a blind spot in the enemy's assumptions. German crews expected engagements at ranges and in conditions that favored their armor and guns.
When Shermans closed rapidly, shifted angles, and presented a moving target that was coordinated as a unit, German advantages could be neutralized. That insight, discovered by trial, error, and necessity, would ripple through manuals and training in ways that were slow but enduring. Decades later, with archives opened and operational files cross-referenced, analysts would point to Pool's engagements as illustrative rather than anomalous. Small unit initiative, radical crew training, and the tactical exploitation of terrain could compensate for material disadvantages. What makes the discovery accidental is not that Pool set out to rewrite doctrine. He did not. But that his personal habits, honed from childhood into command, happened to hit upon a form of fighting that exposed systemic weaknesses in German armored tactics that remained significant even as armor technology progressed. The exposure was not a sensational reveal. It was a steady unmasking of assumptions, a slow accumulation of evidence that, by the time historians mapped it, had altered the understanding of armored war. The human weight of those changes, however, always returned to small things: the hand on a bolt, the measured cadence before a charge, the look two men shared in the cramped heat of a turret when orders were too long to say. Pool's crew taught others not because the manual said so, but because troops who survived his methods told the story in the only way that mattered, by repeating the drills until the muscle remembered. In training yards months later, men worked under instructors who had passed on Pool's rhythms without always naming their source. The Army studied the outcomes in formal settings and, in some cases, codified aspects of the approach into doctrine. Still, institutional acceptance lagged. Even after the war, the memory of those days bowed like an old man's back. Pool did not seek limelight. He returned to a quieter life and carried with him the ghost of noise and the shapes of lost comrades. The stories that remained in circulation were a mixture of admiration and uncomfortably framed questions. Had audacity cost lives when caution might have saved them? Those questions never had tidy answers. The men who had been with him knew that in the calculus of survival, audacity backed by discipline had often made the difference between life and death. They also knew the ledger of loss. There was another kind of legacy, the way knowledge propagated slowly across decades. Files that once gathered dust were reopened. German after-action reports, when compared with American accounts, showed repeated references to unexpected close-quarters attacks and unpredictably fast Shermans.
Military educators lectured on the importance of initiative and crew drills. NATO doctrines decades later would emphasize flexibility and combined arms in ways that echoed, if only faintly, the tight, almost animal coordination Pool's crew had executed in a field in June.
In that sense, the accidental discovery did not so much expose secret plans as it illuminated a vulnerability bred of habit and expectation, a weakness enemy commanders had built their tactics around and that audacity could unpick. But the human story, the bone of it, continued to insist on its priority. Veterans gathered years afterward, their faces like maps of the past, and told each other those small, exacting tales. Which hedgerow held a trap? Which farmhouse had been burned? Whose name would not be at the next reunion? Pool's name survived in those circles, not merely as a label, but as the echo of a way to fight and a way to keep men alive. Official recognition stumbled. Recommendations for the Medal of Honor and similar accolades circulated, but did not culminate in the formal honors some expected. That absence did not erase contributions, it complicated them. When historians later wrote of how tactical improvisation could shape broader campaigns, Pool's engagements were a thread. They represented an accidental discovery that, through the persistence of those who survived to tell and teach it, exposed, over time, structural weaknesses in an enemy's assumptions. The revelation was not dramatic in the tabloid sense. It was slow, cumulative, and remarkable for how ordinary it had been at the moment of discovery. A small man from Texas, a crew that moved in sleep and sweat like a single organism, and a battlefield that refused to obey neat maps. The road ahead in this story moves toward the wound's immediate consequences, the long bureaucratic process of recognition and its delays, and the quiet human reckoning Pool faced when machine and man could no longer be joined in the way they had been. It will also trace how, piece by piece, the tactical lessons he pressed into practice found their way into training grounds and study halls, sometimes without attribution, sometimes celebrated, and sometimes quietly folded into doctrine. For now, there is a pause between the roar of engines and what comes after: surgery, convalescence, the tug of a life redirected, and the slow, stubborn spread of an idea born in fear and craft. The ambulance stopped with no ceremony. Inside, the world reduced itself to sound and pressure. The hiss of the stretcher wheels, a breath that wasn't his, the steady, small voice of the medic repeating the same few sentences as if they were a prayer. Pool remembered the heat of the turret, the iron taste after the blast, the way things went wrong in the space of a breath, and then, impossibly, right again, when someone leaned a shoulder against a stuck hatch. He remembered diesel smoke and the smell of scorched canvas, and a man's hand, Mathewson's hand, clamping a bandage so tight Pool's skin showed pale beneath. After that, there were flashes of bright light, of someone shouting above the wind, of being hauled out and laid on cold metal that smelled like oil and antiseptic. The hospital was a long, low building that hummed at night. Nurses moved like tides between beds. Lamps threw islands of yellow over pale faces. For a while, Pool did not belong to the hours. The surgeons came and went in measured cadence. They spoke to one another with the kind of brisk civility that sometimes hides exhaustion. They called wounds by names: compound fracture, shrapnel, words that flattened the immediacy into categories. He woke to pain so precise it seemed to know his body better than he did. He woke to the small, relentless noise of other men's breathing, and to the squeak of rubber soles as someone rolled a cart down the ward. When the field surgeon's hand gripped his arm and asked if he understood the operation, Poole nodded because his voice was a dry thing and words felt impossible. He understood in the way a man understands that a bridge must be crossed. They worked through the night. Later, someone told him the bone had been shattered into a scatter of small truths, and that they had sewn what could be sewn. For weeks there were stitches and dressings, and nights when dreams and memories braided together. The face of a German kid in a window pane that had once held gunpowder. Matthewson's laugh when he cursed in German. The turret's cramped heat, becoming, in dream, a coffin with a sky above. Recovery rewrote the metrics of his days. Where once a minute had been measured by the rotation of gears and the slap of treads, now every hour was measured by a nurse's rounds and the time a painkiller took to work. The body, so accustomed to obeying the machine, hesitated. Hands that had known the precise torque of a bolt now found stitches and stiffness that refused easy command. Poole learned impatience anew. He learned patience by breaking it into tasks, getting out of bed, standing with the help of a rail, walking the corridor with a nurse's steadying arm, small doctrinal mantras imposed by rehabilitation staff. He hated the exercises at first, resented them the way a man resents counsel that forces him to face his mistakes. But muscle remembers. Eventually, his foot answered with a memory of its own, not the tank's rhythm, but a human rhythm, slow and insistently his. Letters arrived like slow reconnoitering columns. Some were meticulous. Accounts from other crews, names of men who had died in hedgerows, orders that had been misread, a corrected time stamped in smudged ink. Others were easier. A folded photograph of a farmhouse, smoke curling from a roof, with a scrawl on the back, "We held here, your move saved us." A stack of forms from headquarters demanded signatures and records. Recommendations for awards waited in gray envelopes, heavy with bureaucratic hope. The recommendations traveled up and down channels of command like passengers on a train that kept changing its route.
There were pauses where the paperwork lay idle on desks, and Poole learned the weight of silence. Not the absolute quiet of the ward, but the silence of decisions postponed. Poole's crew visited when they could. They came in shifts, some on leave, some discharged, some still bleeding into life in ways that left them quieter than before. Matthewson sat by the window and smoked, and told bad jokes that pooled laughter like fuel. Reyes shaved with trembling hands and said nothing at first, watching Poole's face for a sign that the world inside it matched the world outside. They talked mostly about the small things that anchor a life: whose boot had been scuffed, whose letter had arrived, the shape of the bread they had traded for morphine in a last-ditch barter. They also argued, with the bluntness that had always been their way of loving one another, about the decisions in battle, about when audacity had become risk, and whether any of them had crossed the line. "You're being modest, Poole," Matthewson said once, not unkindly. This, he tapped the bandaged limb, this was more than luck. Poole did not disagree, but he would not let the talk harden into legend. He saw the ledger of loss and felt the numbers like teeth along his ribs. For all the stories that called their actions cunning or brave, there were names absent from reunions and chairs that would never be filled again. He thought of a boy he had once handed an extra ration to, the way the boy had said "Danke" with a half-smile that belonged to an age that should not have been in that place. Those faces came forward in quiet hours and became a proper accusation, an insistence that survival is never only victory. Outside the ward, in offices that smelled of pipe tobacco and old paper, the machinery of recognition ground in contradictory directions. A colonel at a regional headquarters admired the reports, noted the changes in enemy behavior, and drafted a recommendation. A staff officer, moved by charts and casualty statistics, saw something else. The risk for heavy losses had been higher in some operations, and that note carried weight in rooms where names and deaths were tabulated. Committee meetings convened, with Red Cross men bringing summaries, supply officers citing limited munitions, and a legal clerk worried about precedent. By the time the final recommendation reached a desk in Washington, the argument had thinned into an administrative note, an honorable mention perhaps, a medal delayed. Poole learned to be simultaneously proud and indifferent. The idea of a medal, of a brass disc pinned to a jacket, sought oddly against the memory of those who had been less fortunate. He had seen enough metal and light to know symbols do not replace the tactile work of duty. He had seen officers hold papers like promises and then let them fold into drawer bottoms. He told friends he did not care. Sometimes he meant it.
At other times, the absence of official recognition felt like a particular private injustice, an erasure of the man-sized facts that had kept his crew alive. The slow spread of their tactics happened in other hands. Young instructors in training yards watched old film reels and read terse reports, and then walked into clay and scrub fields to teach what looked at first like improvisation. They taught men to move together, to speak with muscle and glance, to trust the man on their left with the same economy of motion Poole had demanded. Those lessons became drills with names and charts. Close maneuver, crew discipline, mutual responsibility. Institutional reluctance stuttered when results arrived on paper. Reduced casualties in exercises, faster recovery from ambush drills, more effective clearing of obstacles. Doctrine committees plotted and discussed, and slowly, almost guiltily, words once sparked in a cramped turret became sanctioned in blue books and printed manuals. Often the origin was unnamed. People who taught the work carried the memory like an old song, but did not always know its composer. Poole received a clipping once, small, folded into a letter from a former lieutenant, about a college that had published an article arguing for initiative-driven countermeasures that sounded suspiciously close to what Poole's crew had done. The author cited anonymous field cases from the summer of the offensive. Poole kept the clipping folded in a drawer beside a pair of well-worn gloves. Recognition, indirect and quiet, arrived like rain in a dry season. Welcome, insufficient, and easily diverted. At home, the world had expectations of its own. Texas lay flat under a wide, bright sky that seemed to have no memory at all of explosions. Heat rose from the road in blue waves. Tractors plowed with a steady, ungainly rhythm. Poole's house stood on a lane of packed dirt,
a porch that had seen hurricanes and sun, and a mailbox that still carries bills and a neighbor's biscuits. The familiarities were at once consoling and cruel. They reminded him he had survived, and that life went on as if his absence had been a brief interruption. He tried to take up the old tasks. He mended fences with a methodical patience that bored him. He worked the land with an economy of motion that felt at times humbling. Muscle taught itself new rhythms. The land offered steady reward. Neighbors came and went, some awkward with sympathy, others direct with help. A man brought an extra box of nails. A woman pressed lamb stew into his hands without comment. People measured heroism in simple ways. A cake, a handshake, a lawn cut when a neighbor was absent. For Pool, those gestures carried more weight than any brass disc could. But the inner work, what one becomes after the machine that once specified movement is no longer the same machine, was less easy to tend.
He woke at odd hours, the turret's impressions rising like a tide, and found himself adjusting for a lever's pull that was no longer there. He would stand at the doorway and watch a hay wagon, its wheels turning, and for a moment the world rearranged itself into targets and avenues. Sound slipped sideways, thunder became incoming fire. The distant engine of a tractor became a Sherman backing into place. He learned the language of nightmares and how they took the day hostage. The men who had returned to farms and factories with him were not free of those noises. They learned to speak guardedly about them and to drink in a way that made sense to people who needed not to think until the bottle ran low. Pool found, slowly, another way to belong: teaching. Not in formal academies at first, not with lectures and charts, but in back rooms and community halls. Boys enlisted in the National Guard came to listen to an old man tell how a crew moves as one. He taught them how to check a bolt, how to listen for an engine's complaint, how to move a hatch without letting a moment tell the enemy everything. He taught patience, a kind of muscle memory that was not only physical but moral, how to carry responsibility for the man on your left. The boys, some raw, some eager with the foolish self-assurance of youth, learned to do the small, exact things that save lives. Pool found in teaching a narrow redemption. He could not bring back those he had lost, but he could pass on a way of being that might keep another man's brother alive. The world around him continued, with all its small humiliations and gentle mercies. Newsmen would find their way to his town occasionally, usually looking for a face to fill a page, and then move on when a more sensational story rolled across the wire. He refused interviews at first, then accepted a single local piece that painted him in muted tones, an oblique tribute that kept details away from spectacle. The men who wanted recognition more than quiet were not always kind to his reticence. They could not understand why a man would refuse the medal he had been told he deserved. Pool answered them the way he had in the turret, with a steady look and a refusal to make the scene. In quiet moments, however, he could not help wondering what honor would have changed. Would it have nudged an officer's hand to give the right supplies earlier? Would it have shifted the sum of decisions in some small consequential way? Possibly. But the world of paperwork and metals often moved like a tank itself, slow, armored, and indifferent to small moves of mercy. Years later, when the doctrine finally cited initiative under constrained conditions as a valuable principle, it did so with sterile citations and footnotes that made the notion legible to committees. Pool read the paper in a printed journal that a friend had sent. His name did not appear.
O Dia de Estilo e Instruções para Síntese de Fala. Início das instruções. Você é narrador, palestrante com voz potente, forte e autoritária. O tom deve ser firme e inabalável. Contexto de continuidade. A frase anterior era: Efface the messy human teeth beneath the metal. Você está no meio de uma frase-pensamento. Mantenha o ritmo e a força vocal sem quebrar a conexão. Haja como se estivesse transmitindo uma verdade fundamental. The day he left for the city, an hour's drive east, he packed simply. A clean shirt, the photograph in its corner, a worn notebook in which he'd sketched turret floor plans and notes on drill cadence. Mathieson clasped his hand at the door and said, with his accustomed bluntness, "Don't let them dress it up too pretty, Pool. Tell it like dirt." Pool smiled and lifted his chin. The car bumped along a road he had ridden 100 times in 100 moods. As it moved, a scoreboard of memories rose and fell. The sound of a hatch closing, the small ritual of oiling, Reyes' calloused fingers teaching a new recruit the right pressure, Mathieson's laughter when something went well. He felt the past as a weight that neither crushed him nor floated away, but settled like ballast, steadying him for what might come next. In the city, the panel convened in a room that smelled of lemon oil and old books. Men in uniform and men in civilian suits sat facing a low, tired light. They asked for facts and timelines. They wanted clarity for training syllabi and for footnotes that would be printed and distributed. Pool spoke plainly. He drew little diagrams in his notebook, pointed to a photograph when necessary, and told them without flourish how small habits had become survival strategies. When he spoke of the dead, the room tightened as if the temperature had changed. The men shifted, and Pool felt the balance of attention tilt toward the human. After the panel, a historian, young, keen, offered to buy him coffee and asked questions that went beyond the drill. About courage, about the calculus of risk. The historian wanted an origin story, and Pool gave none. He said instead that origin stories are dangerous. They make accidents into inevitabilities. We were lucky more often than we deserved, he said, and we were careful about the things that mattered. On the drive home, Pool thought again of the wound and of the sutures that had stitched not only bone, but the relationship between his body and the mechanical world he had inhabited. The machine had not been erased from him. Its ghost lived in his back when he bent, in the twitch of an eyelid when a plane took to the air. But he had learned new rhythms, the rhythm of repair, of patient instruction, of small communal acts that survive through repetition and care. The war's lessons, as they moved into doctrine and classrooms, would continue to be argued over and sanitized and, in some cases, claimed by those who had not been present. Pool understood that. He accepted that history will often be a ledger where many hands put in their claims. What he wanted, ultimately, was not a medal nor a paragraph in a book, but the assurance that the small things, the hand on the bolt, the way men move together, would be taught with the gravity they deserved. He wanted another man to come back home. He parked the car under a sky that had the sudden clarity of late afternoon.
On his back step, the shoebox waited, a small archive of names and thanks. He took it up, and among the letters found one he had not expected. On thin paper, in a careful hand, from a sergeant in a training yard many states away, who wrote that a doctrine manual had printed a diagram nearly identical to the one in Pool's notebook. The sergeant thanked him, and then, in a postscript, more quietly, asked if Poole would be willing to write a note, just a few lines, on the ethical responsibility of command. Poole read the request twice. He thought of the panel, of the city's lemon-oiled rooms, of the men who had taught and those who had refused to teach. He thought of Mathieson and Reyes and of all the hands that had steadied his own. He set the letter down and sat in the waning light, the house around him a collection of small shadows. The idea of writing those lines felt like another kind of surgery, to cut away the excess and leave a clean truth. He fetched his notebook and, in slow, careful strokes, began to write. He wrote not for medals or for committees, but for the men who would follow. He wrote of responsibility as practice, how it is not a single heroic moment, but 1,000 small acts of care. He wrote of listening and of the obligation to bear what one can bear for another. Outside, a wind lifted the dry grass in the lane and set it whispering like a distant conversation. Poole paused, dipped his pen, and kept going, each sentence measured, each clause a rivet. When he finished, he folded the paper into an envelope and addressed it with a hand that had steadied. He thought about the way an idea travels, how it begins in the cramped heat of survival and ends in the careful instructions that another man might read before he goes into a place that will ask everything of him. Then he walked to the mailbox and dropped the letter in, feeling the weight of it ease his chest like a hand laid over a wound. He did not know at that moment the shape the rest of his life would take. He only knew there were small things to do, and that he intended to do them. The machine had changed him. He had changed the machine. In the murmur of the evening, the two sat together like old acquaintances who had learned to peep one another's company. And yet, even as he folded the last page into the envelope, a certain restlessness moved through him, a sense that the work of memory and repair was unfinished. There were faces to remember in their fullness, questions to raise in rooms that liked tidy answers, and a corps of young men who needed not only drills, but a moral compass. The road ahead promised more small acts and, perhaps, larger reckonings. He turned back to the house, the photograph of the crew in his pocket like a quiet coin. The porch light clicked on as twilight darkened, and from inside, the radio, small, obedient, voices murmured news of a world that moved on.
Poole stood a moment beneath the porch roof, his silhouette a small shape against the wide sky, and felt the slow shape of time fold around him. The war left in him as a seam, healing and teaching operating like thread. He walked inside, set the shoebox on the table, and sat down to write one more letter. This one for a man who had asked for official recognition and could not find the time or the patience to pursue it. Poole's handwriting, which had become steadier with practice, formed the words carefully. He wrote not to insist on honors, but to offer an account, plain and precise, of what had happened in those few days of noise and heat, and of the men who had moved as one. Outside, the night deepened. Somewhere a dog barked and a car passed, ordinary noises stitching the world together. Poole finished his letter, sealed it, and placed it on the mantel beside the photograph. He sat for a while in the quiet and, from the window, watched the land breathe under the stars. The wound remained, a physical thing, yes, with its aches and nights of restless sleep,
but it had altered shape. It had become, in its way, a ledger of duty, an index of lessons, a map of obligations. He thought to himself that the work of a life is often like that. Small, consistent gestures that, over time, shift the balance. The audacity that had once been tested in a field could survive, perhaps most purely, in the teaching that passed from hand to hand. Poole rose, went to the desk, and sat with the rough notebook open. There were plans to make, no pomp, no headlines, only the small, steady labor of turning memory into guidance. He wrote the first line of what might become a manual, or simply a set of instructions for living with others under pressure. Begin with the small things. He underlined it twice, closed the book, and listened to the quiet house. Outside, the lane lay in darkness, and the sky, indifferent and vast, held back its history like a patient witness. Inside, Poole folded his hands and let a tiredness he had earned settle over him like a blanket. Tomorrow there would be more letters, more visitors, perhaps more decisions. For now, he let the night keep him company. Dawn came pale and dry. Poole opened the curtains and let the cold air of morning into the room like a cautionary thought. He dressed without hurry, the motions of a man used to moving in the small hours, and went down the lane to the mailbox. The envelope he had posted the night before was gone. In its place, among the usual circulars and a postcard, lay a single, heavier letter bearing a stamped seal. He sat on the stoop and slit it open with a pocket knife. The first page was formal, typed, courteous, that acknowledged receipt of his account and thanked him for taking the trouble to set things down. It asked, in language that tried for impartiality and failed only a little, whether he would come to the town office to speak with an officer in the records division.
There was mention of corroborating testimony and of a small ceremony should the matter be moved forward. A name was signed at the bottom, J. Hartley, Registrar. Folded inside, on top of the pages, was a postcard photograph of men in a dusty field, faces squinted against sun and heat, half smiling. Poole recognized them at once. He had expected neither such promptness nor such delicacy. His first feeling was a guarded relief, then a careful apprehension. The letter meant that the past, arranged and sealed in his hands, had become legible to an office that could make it official. There would be forms, questions, perhaps an audience. There would be the act of naming things that had been nameless. He let the breath that held him go and rose. By the time he reached his kitchen, the knock had already come. Mrs. Abernathy from down the road stood on the porch with a paper bag in her hand and an expression that belonged somewhere between concern and obligation. Behind her, a young man Poole had seen about the village, Eli, who had taken to hanging at the blacksmith's and at the general store, restless as wind, watched with a face that tried to be patient but failed. "Thought you might like some breakfast," Mrs. Abernathy said. "And I heard there was a letter. Is it the sort of letter that needs a stiff cup of tea?" Poole smiled without pretending cheer. He moved aside a chair and gestured them in. The bag contained biscuits wrapped in cloth and a slab of something sweet. The small, ordinary kindnesses steadied the day. Eli sat at the table and peeled an apple with a knife he had taken from the counter. He was not a soldier.
He had, at 18, a kind of lithe restlessness that mimicked the stories he'd heard. Parades on holidays, the way men recounted feats in the tavern. He listened now with a mix of admiration and hunger. When Poole read the formal line about the town office and the registrar, Eli's eyes brightened as if some distant adventure had been summoned. "So, they want you to tell them?" he asked, "to make it all official?" "That is the sense," Poole said. "They have papers to file. Someone asked for recognition, and the office is doing what it must." Eli set the apple down and watched Poole's hands. "You'll go," he said, as if it were another step on a map he'd already traced. Poole thought of the shoebox on the mantel and the photographs in his pocket. He thought of the men in the postcard and the ledger he had kept, those notations of what had been done and why. He let the breath that held him go and rose. By the time he reached his kitchen, the knock had already come. Mrs. Abernathy from down the road stood on the porch with a paper bag in her hand and an expression that belonged somewhere between concern and obligation. Behind her, a young man Poole had seen about the village, Eli, who had taken to hanging at the blacksmith's and at the general store, restless as wind, watched with a face that tried to be patient but failed. "Thought you might like some breakfast," Mrs. Abernathy said. "And I heard there was a letter. Is it the sort of letter that needs a stiff cup of tea?" Poole smiled without pretending cheer. He moved aside a chair and gestured them in. The bag contained biscuits wrapped in cloth and a slab of something sweet. The small, ordinary kindnesses steadied the day. Eli sat at the table and peeled an apple with a knife he had taken from the counter. He was not a soldier. He had, at 18, a kind of lithe restlessness that mimicked the stories he'd heard. Parades on holidays, the way men recounted feats in the tavern. He listened now with a mix of admiration and hunger. When Poole read the formal line about the town office and the registrar, Eli's eyes brightened as if some distant adventure had been summoned. "So, they want you to tell them?" he asked, "to make it all official?" "That is the sense," Poole said. "They have papers to file. Someone asked for recognition, and the office is doing what it must." Eli set the apple down and watched Poole's hands. "You'll go," he said, as if it were another step on a map he'd already traced. Poole thought of the shoebox on the mantel and the photographs in his pocket. He thought of the men in the postcard and the ledger he had kept, those notations of what had been done and why. "I will go," he said, "but I will go on the terms there are, to be honest. There's no place for stories that gild, or for silence that hides what ought to be named." Mrs. Abernathy nodded, taking him in as if she understood the truth of it. "You always were sensible," she said, "and steady." The house filled with a smaller domestic bustle. Eli offered to help with chores. He seemed, in his clumsy way, to want to be useful.
Poole found himself assigning him small tasks: mend the fence by the orchard, oil the hinges of the barn door, sweep the dust from the shed where the machine sat. In giving the boy work, Poole felt the tilt of purpose return to him. Purpose, he had learned, was a net in which unwanted anxieties could be caught and examined. They walked to the barn together in the soft light. The machine lay dark beneath its cover, the metal cooled to the morning. Poole pulled the tarp aside with the care of a man unwrapping something from memory. Eli peered at the gears as though they might whisper secrets. Poole set a hand on the casing and let that, too, be a kind of comfort. "You taught us to carry one another," Eli said. "Will you teach me to do what you did?" Poole regarded him. There was a sharpness in that request, an attempt to anchor himself to something older than idle talk. "There's a difference between learning how to use a thing and learning how to bear the thing you use," Poole said. "We begin with the small things." So he did. The lessons were not the sort sung in film or the line drills of storybooks. They were patient. How to set an axle so that it would not bind under stress. How to check for fatigue in leather. How to listen to the oddness of a joint and know whether it could wait for repair. Then, once the tools had been understood, he began to teach the other kind of thing, the measures of attention that keep a man from sliding into recklessness. "When you move with another," Poole told him while they tightened a bolt, "you are co-responsible for his body and for what he remembers. You take small acts of care because there is not a single large one that will fix everything. There is only the steady ledger of your days." Eli watched, finger light on the spanner. "And if they want glory," he asked, "what if they think there's glory in it?" "There is a stubborn, honest pride in doing well by a man at your side," Poole said. "There is vanity, too. The distinction is in where your eye rests when you lift a thing, on yourself or on the hand in need." They spent the morning as the house filled with the mild clatter of life. A series of neighbors dropped by with news and with requests. One was a man who had been in the company, Raines, older than Poole, hands knotted by time. He had come not because of ceremony, but because his own name had been attached to a small petition, and he lacked the courage to file it alone. He wanted Poole to accompany him, to be witness should anyone ask. They sat at the table. Raines's voice did not try for grandeur. He said simply that he had been exhausted by the idea of justice being a ledger that never gets balanced. He wanted for himself and for the mates who had died the recognition to be more than paper. He wanted their names to be placed somewhere that could be found. Poole understood. He had written the letters, placed the forms, had folded and mailed his accounts.
The forms had folded and mailed his accounts.